Right, it's 4 o'clock. We got about another 37 guests right now, and I think more will come in. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to this first webinar event organized by both the Royal Society of War Studies and the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Huge crowd. We had 400 people approximately signing in, and it would be wonderful if indeed most of them will turn up and tune in. It's going to be an interesting afternoon, seriously. Let me introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Air Commodore Professor Dr. Frans Ozega. That's a very long title. Just call me Frans, of course. I'm a professor of war studies at Leiden University and also a professor, the chair in war studies at the Netherlands Defense Academy. Joining me as moderator will be Tim Swijs. He's the director of research at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. He will be the moderator this afternoon. And he's also a research fellow at the Netherlands Defense Academy. I will introduce our speaker for today, Frank Hoffman, in a while. Let me introduce first the topic of today, future war. I think it's a very, very important and very topical topic indeed. There's been no shortage of visions of what war would look like if we look at the past 3 decades. Let me run you through a few of those concepts that were bandied about. Let's start in the early 1990s, late 1989. Fourth generation warfare was a very popular concept, being part of the debate among strategic scholars at the end of the Cold War. Then we entered the Balkan crisis, humanitarian operations, and all of a sudden everybody saw new wars, as it was coined by Mary Keldor. We saw, after Desert Storm, the revolution in military affairs debate. Network-centric warfare popped up as a concept. General Krulak came up with the concept of the 3-block war. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happened. Fourth-generation warfare was rediscovered as perhaps a concept that might have some explanatory value for the future. Other people saw the 4th or 5th wave of terrorism as the threat of the future. When we went into Afghanistan and Iraq and we encountered the insurgencies out there, we rediscovered counterinsurgency. Others called it neoclassical counterinsurgency. Again, a vision of what the future of warfare would look like and what the West should be prepared for. Others, in turn, looked more to the virtual environment, and they talked about virtual warfare, also because of the fact that the media seemed to be taking a much more important role in warfare. That started with Desert Storm. It became very apparent during Kosovo, and that was actually a war. Well, Michael Ignatieff said this was a virtual war. 2005, compound warfare pops up as a relevant concept, and the speaker of today actually played a huge role in that. And then in 2006, when we started looking at what was happening in Israel in its fight against Hezbollah, we needed another concept to make sense of what was happening there. And the concept of hybrid warfare was actually coined by Frank Hoffman, the speaker of today. And interestingly, it was the Israelis who invited Frank to Israel to make sense of what their experience had been against Hezbollah. Switching forward to 2014, we see the concept of gray zone warfare, hybrid conflict, political warfare, the dronification of war. Cyber warfare, of course, has never disappeared after the first cyber incidents and the cyber attacks of the 2000s. And these days we see space war popping up. There's been a lot of critique, in particular from the historians, against such visions of future war. They see presentism as one of the problems here. Those concepts seem to focus on what is novel, on what is actually happening right now on the battlefields. And from there, we seem to be extrapolating into the future. And for them, that is not warranted. And they focus more on the continuities. And some of them actually say, well, all you have to do is read Clausewitz on war. And that's all you need to know to understand current warfare. And they do have a point. You have to be careful about focusing too much on what seems to be novel. Other people critique all these concepts because they seem to be biased. There seems to be a service-specific interest behind the arguments, or a regional bias behind these arguments. On the other hand, all these concepts also serve a purpose. They inform defense planning, they inform doctrines, and sometimes even current operations. And at least the least of the thing that they do is they create awareness of, indeed, some novel aspects that we see out there in warfare, about the strategic issues and challenges, that Western troops have been facing in very complex contexts. Sometimes all they do is rediscover old forms of warfare that we simply have forgotten, and thereby highlight our strategic blind spots. And another very important value of those concepts is that they inspire academic, scholarly, and policy debates in the Western world, and that is very fruitful indeed. Now, let me introduce the speaker of today. It's almost impossible not to have heard of him, but let me just introduce him. He was educated as a Marine Corps officer, he was trained as a company commander, and in the early 90s, he became an analyst for the Pentagon, for the Marine Corps, and he now works at National Defense University. He has published more than 100 articles, book chapters. Hello, Tim. You're big on the screen right now for a reason. But he has been active really a fixture in the debate on fourth generation warfare, on compound warfare, on hybrid warfare in the 2000s. More recently, he was one of the lead authors in the US defense strategy. He's been an advisor to General and later on Secretary of Defense Mattis. And just this summer, he gave a similar lecture as he will today for NATO, where NATO is debating what the future operational concept should look like. I haven't mentioned that he also found time to do a PhD at King's College, one of the premier institutions when it comes to war and strategic studies. And I'm really looking forward to his newest book called Mars Adapting, Learning During Wartime. Frank, welcome to you. Looking forward to your pitch. Tim, floor is yours.
Thanks, sir. Great. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Frans. We are very pleased to host such a distinguished strategist as Frank Hoffman. The KVBK and HCSS, I believe, share a mission, and that mission is to inform and enrich Dutch, European and Dutch strategic discourse on defense and security. Now, in previous centuries, defense thinkers would exchange thoughts predominantly through books and through mail correspondences. And this is also how I first got to know about Frank, first about his work, and then we corresponded. And then one time a couple of years ago, I visited DC, and Frank invited me over for drinks at the Ritz. And there he invited me to a great variety of ideas that kept coming, flowing like a tsunami when he was writing them down on dozens of napkins. So that was a great experience. These days, we can travel more and more, but due to the horrific pandemic that we're going through, I believe we will look back in a couple of years and decades as the pandemic marking the great digital shift. And due to the digital shift, we can now organize webinars and have strategic thinkers such as Frank beam in and talk to Dutch audiences and European audiences directly. So that is a great thing. Frank, before we give you the word, I wanted to set out some rules for the road. One, this meeting is not held under the Chatham House rule, which means that you can repeat and attribute what has been said here. There's one caveat here, though. If you want to quote someone directly in a written or a digital outlet, please contact the one who said it directly to confirm that that is what he or she indeed said. Two, the Q&A is open today. So please, audience, submit your questions through the Q&A. And we'll be monitoring the function closely, and we'll draw on them in the Q&A for Frank. Three, about timing, it's now almost 4:10. Frank will have the floor for about 45 minutes. He said he was going to talk about 30 minutes, but he also said that he was a verbose man. So, Frank, following your presentation, we're going to move to a Q&A. As you know, it's five hours later here on Central European time. So the goal is to wrap up by 5:15, so the military officers can still enjoy their dinners. With that, Frank, over to you.
Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction, overly generous in my view. Let's see if I can get my slides up. Are we sharing?
Not yet.
We're able to do this.
Let's go back to Frank. And Roy, make sure that Frank is the presenter, right?
Yep.
Good. Yes, Frank is starting to share content.
All right. Great. Well, I'm really honored to be here today. I'm also humbled that so many people signed up for that. Hopefully, that with that kind of number of input, we'll have a great interaction and we'll both learn. I get a lot out of these interactions.
Great. Frank, one thing, could you enlarge your slideshow so we can see the sort of full screen?
Yeah, let me go share. I got this new shared button that's not going active. How are we doing?
That's already better. And then if you do it full screen on your side, it's even larger. We can still see the sidebars. That's why.
Trying to get out of that. We still in sidebar?
Yeah. What I believe you can do is enlarge it again, please. Yes, and then go to slideshow a bit to the left with your mouse.
I think here we go.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, since we are going to be speaking live today, I do have to offer a disclaimer. I'm speaking for myself and not the current administration of the United States government or the Pentagon. But again, greatly honored to be here today. My presentation today is going to follow an outline. I'd like to talk about the changing character of warfare. I would like to be a little more distinct about the use of the words war and warfare. I'm going to offer some ideas about what I think might be changing and how students and professionals might want to think about that. I'm hopefully not going to tell you what to think, but I'll give you some frameworks and some tools to think about the past and the future. I'm also going to introduce an analytical framework that I've called the 4 Faces of Future Conflict, which is my latest synthesis of some of the debates that Franz opened up about what's going on with warfare, and hopefully an inclusive model that will allow everybody to see how valuable some of these different perspectives are. And then from the interaction I've had with audiences, particularly in Europe, I've developed an expanded version of my initial analytic framework, and I think that will offer some insights today. And I'll conclude with some insights and some conclusions about what the implications are for various states, and I'll make some differentiation between European states, United States, about risk and probabilities that will affect doctrine, investments perhaps, and how we teach warfare. We're having a little. I'd like to open up and be very explicit about an hypothesis that I'm making, and Franz set me up perfectly. I don't believe that anyone should be accused of presentism. I've reframed the argument about presentism versus novelty as immutability versus change. And I believe that particularly for the United States, our inability to open ourselves to what is changing is more the source of our problem than embracing immutability. And I believe that it is blinding us to a rigorous evaluation of the changing character of warfare, and it is delaying our adaptation to a broader definition of national security and war than we've had in the past. And I draw upon Clausewitz, ironically, since most of the immutables embrace Clausewitz themselves. Colin Gray, Wick Murray, General McMaster, all cite Clausewitz as a justification for being immutable. But I think there's more of an argument in Clausewitz and the chameleon-like nature of warfare that we need to embrace. And this gets to a central question raised by Sir Hugh Strachan a number of years ago, that one of the problems we have today, if we're going to discuss if war is changing, and he's arguing that perhaps it's not, we need to know what first war is. And I agree with him, but I think he actually had, in context, a narrower definition of what war is and a more traditional and a more Western view of what war is. And I think this might also be either a second hypothesis or a second challenge to the community, is that our construct about what war is may be more of a socio-cultural artifact or a construct that we've embraced that may not have as much utility in the future as warfare evolves. Different cultures react differently to these changes in warfare, and our conception of what war is in the transatlantic community may be outdated or may be too narrow. It is not universally held by all societies the way Sir Hugh or I might define war and warfare based upon Clausewitz. And I think that some of our competitors do not share those perspectives, those lenses, and those insights. And we need to be aware of that if we're really going to understand the changing character of war. This is General Dunford. For those of you who are not familiar with American military officers, General Dunford spoke at the National Defense University a number of years ago and always spoke about the changing character of war. And he admitted that this warfare is changing. It's changing more rapidly than the American military has adapted, and he felt that we were behind. But I could never get General Dunford to define with any degree of specificity what exactly he meant was changing. I think most of the time he was complaining about the rate of adaptation inside the United States, and he wasn't looking externally at what is going on in war and warfare. But it is a correct, I think, interpretation that the changing character of war has changed. But we need to know exactly what that means, and with some degree of rigor and some degree of fidelity, and we've not had that yet. One way of coming up with some rigor is coming up with some frameworks or some sets of questions. And this is the one I've used for a number of years based on a lovely book done by Hugh Strawn out of Oxford University, where we ask ourselves some questions. And I have these 3 whys and a how that get at some issues. And this is one framework. One can bin or categorize a number of advocates in the literature. Who is fighting? Is it foreign fighters? Is it terrorists? Is it transnational actors? Or is it state versus state? It's a very simple way of understanding, and you can look at some of the theories that Franz listed, and you can start, binning some people who are focusing on the who. Some people focus on the where, the cyberspace dimension, space warfare. Urban warfare is getting a lot of discussion in the United States, particularly in the ground community, which would be the most affected by that. But where fighting occurs does influence the character of war and how you might structure yourself if you believe that you're going to be fighting only or mostly in major cities. A lot of people focus on why actors and polities fight. Why do certain groups, nation states, and transnational entities, why are they fighting? Identity, land, honor, tribe, olive trees. There's a lot of causes that promote or incentivize or incite violence. So some scholars focus on that, particularly the political orientation of the actors. I'm coming from a military background, so I've always been kind of living entirely within this 4th category, how the adversary fights, methods, modes of war, kinds of warfare, and also to a degree, perhaps technologies. There are American advocates and authors and analysts who focus entirely in the technological domain. And we can discuss some of those today. In fact, I'll list a few of those are. But we should understand that we, by ourselves, don't necessarily get to define what war is, and that there are other strategic cultures and other adversaries or potential rivalries that might have different conceptions about what war and warfare is. And this list may in and of itself not capture everything. Another framework. Some students might be familiar with this presentation. This used to be the basis for my discussions and lectures over the last 10 or 15 years. And it is a construct that shows types of warfare from no violence over a red line that I call war, where violence begins, and then these other types of warfare, irregular, hybrid, limited, and theater war. And underneath that is what the American military defines as unconventional war, which is where our special forces develop proxies or resistant movements. And I argue that unconventional warfare can be conducted across the entire continuum of conflict, although some people focus entirely in the counterinsurgency or counterterrorism box. But at the far end, theater conventional warfare with an adversary that has WMD, I argue, is somewhat distinct. Then there's limited conventional warfare, where most of us in the military spend our lives and focus myopically only on states fighting conventionally in uniforms with combined arms that are somewhat similar to ours in a symmetric sense. There's this discussion about hybrid that I started 15 years ago with General Mattis. We thought that non-state actors would be climbing up the escalation and lethality curve because of technology diffusion. and would become much more violent and much more capable, and thus not mitigated, ameliorated, or defeated by standard counterinsurgency techniques. I think the last 15 years proved that correct, both in the sense that that's where non-state actors or small states and terrorism groups could go. What I think we got wrong was we believed in American unipolarity and dominance for some period of time, and we thought states would move down through proxy forces and militias down into the hybrid category. And I see some evidence with proxy wars from Iran and via Hezbollah, with Russians in Georgia, Russians in Ukraine, that's, somewhat there. So I think there's something there to hybrid warfare as we had originally defined it in the middle of the conflict spectrum. We have spent much of the last 15 years in this irregular warfare and counterterrorism block, in the lower, more distributed forms that can be mitigated with counterinsurgency techniques that we have known in the past. So that's, none of these new ideas necessarily displace old ideas. They just add to, enrich, and provide greater granularity than I think we've had in the past. In this far left block that I've marked in the gray blocks, sorry for the acronym, the MSAC is Measure Short of Armed Conflict, a term used in the United States. Gray zone is used in the United States, and political warfare is also used as a term to cover this area of contested adversarial competition that is short of armed conflict, deliberate, explicit violence for political purpose. And I know in Europe, sometimes hybrid is used in that space, not used as much in the United States, but I know that hybrid's also used there. So for the European audience this afternoon, you can add the NATO employment of hybrid threats or hybrid activity into that block as well. That's one continuum. It gets a lot of different theories into the mix. It offers a rich array of things to worry about. It expands our thinking of conflict beyond war, that red line. And we should also argue whether that red line really exists at all anyway, if that's a Clausewitzian construct that we need to dismiss or expand to the left, as this slide kind of suggests. That is a debate that exists here, and it exists, I think, over in Europe as well. This is one way of binning it. And this assumption of violence from low to high is, of course, is a generalization. There are irregular wars that have been extremely violent and had thousands of people die, and there have been limited conventional wars. But generally, I see this as low to high in terms of the potential for violence, casualties, and destruction. Just one way of thinking about it. And I've kind of been moving off that, and this presentation today is an expansion of going into another direction that I want to introduce you to. Some people bin entirely based upon technology. This is another way of thinking about it. In the United States, particularly around the Pentagon, particularly around our industrial complex, this is another way of thinking about things. Rail guns, hypervelocity missiles, artificial intelligence, autonomy, swarms, robotics, the quantum computer there in the lower right-hand picture. There's a lot of ways of thinking about this, but as Rob Johnson has pointed out, I think it's an important distinction to make earlier in the brief. New technologies in and of themselves don't win. They have to be thought about conceptually. You have to have the doctrine to employ them properly. You have to have the training, the education. There's got to be perhaps an organizational change that goes along with that. So this is one aspect of thinking about the future, but in and of itself, some of the theories that we've dealt with over the last couple of years have overplayed the role of technology and underplayed the creation of capabilities and their utility. Since all war is a interactive dynamic of action and reaction, can you really create capabilities that are going to guarantee victory or increase your odds of success? But Dr. Johnson's point here from Oxford is correct. Technology in and of itself doesn't do very much. Another way of thinking about wars is the frequency and type debate. This slide shows 4 different kinds of wars from the database up at Oslo. You will note that the pink and red lines are very small numbers. Those are interstate and major wars. They occur infrequently. They're usually a low number. They're very consequential. So this slide doesn't show how costly they are, how many fatalities they generate. It just talks about the frequency of these wars. But you'll note the frequency is largely in the internal war, civil wars, wars inside of societies, single societies, sometimes with that get externalized. And you'll see that it goes up and down over time. But there's a large focus here and a large frequency that suggests that most wars are internalized. Most wars are within countries. They're not external threats to other states, except for regional stability and some of the outflows like immigration, displaced personnel, that do come from these wars. There was an argument a number of years ago that I participated in that suggested that war was going away, that the history of mankind had changed, and that war was going to become a construct that would only be studied, in historical terms. And there was a rationale for that. If you look around the peak part of that slide and you see a trend from 1991 down to almost 2010, there was a clear trend downward in the number and the lethality kind of conflicts. But again, history is an evolving construct, and there are reasons wars were going down. The structure of the international system, the degree of resource equality or sharing, there's other pressures that cause wars to go up and down. And I had projected at one time that we should expect a reversal in these trends, and that war as a phenomenon would be going up. In the last 5 or 6 years, if you took this data out to 2020, I think would bear out, unfortunately, this fact that the number of wars, if not the fatalities associated with wars, or particularly the human costs, can trend upwards. And we obviously want to stop that trend and move it in another direction, if we can think about it. Again, that's another issue and debate in the field. Let's shift over into my new construct and see if we can both explain it and justify it. So one of the things I've been doing is trying to put more rigor in the conversation about what exactly is changing. So it's not frequency, it's not technology, it might be kinds of war, but I wanted a degree of granular analysis and another degree of getting at what's exactly changing and what are the implications of those changes. And I'm going to discuss about 8 things that I've come up with as potential things to talk about that's changing in the character of warfare. And again, warfare is how wars are conducted, not the war as a phenomena, war as a interaction between 2 states or 2 actors, just the conduct of warfare. And I have 8 items that I have defined so far for classroom purposes, but I think there's probably 9, 10, 11, or 12. And I bet in this group, we could easily perhaps double my presentation. But let's discuss these 4 for right now, and I'll show you my analysis of where these shifts are going. We can talk about whether direct versus indirect forms of attack are being employed. Are militaries being applied against militaries, or are proxies and non-state actors being motivated, funded, supported, and directed against other states? Direct versus indirect. The second item here is the physical versus non-physical means. What tools are being employed to achieve security outcomes? Is it kinetic or is it non-kinetic is the simplest way to explain that. This third item, what effects are being desired? Not the tools, but the outcomes that are being pursued. Are we trying to destroy the capability of the fielded military? Are we trying to destroy the physical production capacity of the state? Are we trying to destroy or eliminate communication between the two? What is the desired effect? Or are we going after people's minds or the mind of the commanders? Is it paralysis and disruption of the national command and control system? Or is it the civilian population's perspective and their support for their government or for their military? Is someone trying to shatter the Clausewitzian Trinity? And this fourth item, something I've been involved in for a long time, what is the locus of the military conflict? Is it a fielded force away as the target set, or is it the civilians and the homeland? And up until about 9/11 in the United States, we thought we only had a military that existed entirely for the away game. And after 9/11, we realized that the homeland is not a sanctuary, and there's many reasons to think that that trend is continuing, if not in the terrorism world, certainly in the homeland security world and the critical infrastructure that some nation states seem to be quite adept at targeting right now. So if you take these 4 items and you were to try to use this Likert scale to try to measure where are we today and where we have been going the last 10 years and where we might go in the next 10 years, I would offer these scores. Again, this is just one person's viewpoint. This is just my perspective on where we're at. When I use this in seminar, I get entirely different conversations with my students. But in essence, I'm arguing that we have moved from direct forms of attack to more proxy forces. And I believe that in the future that will continue even more. I believe that we are going from largely kinetic type operations that where I call a 2 to more non-physical means, perhaps a 1. Conversely, I see an interest in moving away in conflict, if not war, from the physical effects against the mind, either of the commander, the fielded theater force, the national command authorities, or the civilian population. So there's a shift towards cognitive outcomes being the desired effect, both in the measure short of armed conflict in the gray zone, but also in warfare. Then finally, I think since 9/11, there's been a shift in our mindset that the homeland is as much, at least a part of the target set for most of our opponents, whether they're terrorists or whether they're great power competition at this point in time. And that, again, has been a blind spot in particularly the U.S. military for some period of time. Another set of questions one might think about, 4 more. This notion of conventional massed force versus, distributed precision as the decisive form of warfare. Do numbers matter as much, or is quality more important? Is it more important to distribute and use smart and small versus the heavy, expensive conventionality of mass force to get results? I think that's a change, debatable, and I may not be defining this very well. Some people want it to be just concentrated versus distributed. Some people want it to be ground versus air. There's a couple ways of getting at that particular issue. Of great interest of late is the man versus autonomous distinction. Obviously, 500 years ago, it was fully manned, and then we started using animals, and then we started using machines, but people were still making the decisions. Now we're using machines that are capable of supporting manpower and decision making. So perhaps we're at a level of augmentation. There are proponents for and against, the army of none argument by Paul Scher and others, that war is becoming more automated, more robotic, more remotely operated, and that there's implications in that worth studying. This third element is something that Rob Johnson, T.X. Hammes, and General Dunford have all brought out in their articles on the future of war, that the decision-making speed that is required to be secure in the future is accelerating and compressing. I think NATO has understood that. You see discussions about the poly-mil interface, command and control, delegation of authorities, some communication, interoperability. There's this expectation that there's been an acceleration in the speed of decision-making. General John Allen, now head of the Brookings Institution here in Washington, has written a book with another co-author, on hyper warfare behind this particular aspect. So some people see that. This last item is the most complex to explain, but it's perhaps the most important, and it's rarely discussed, which amazes me. But it deals with new technologies impacting the offensive or defensive dominance of war, and it requires specific examples in certain competitions, air versus air defense, ground versus something. Hypervelocity missiles, quantum computers, and artificial intelligence are major technological impulses and investments that one can make that might alter offense versus defense dominance. And it's important, I think, to study and understand what new technologies might be bringing to that issue. And we all believe that the defense is the most dominant, but there are issues in terms of, I think, cruise missile attacks. There's an argument to be made about cyber warfare, where it's offensive dominance and defenses are always beaten. You need to understand this in each of these different competitions. Submarine warfare has a different answer than space warfare, has a different answer than cyber warfare. But this is an important area. I'm not very articulate today about explaining it, but the important aspect of this is if you're investing in defense in an offense dominant competition, you might be playing a losing game or a cost imposing strategy. So if the missile is always going to get through, but you're dependent upon missile defense, you've got to spend a lot more into missile defense to balance off the dominance in that particular technology. I was at a conference not too long ago, and people were discussing artificial intelligence, and they were investing entirely in a lot of defensive capabilities. And that entire argument was predicated upon an assumption that artificial intelligence wasn't changing the dominance in missile attack, strike warfare, and missile defense. And I was arguing, I think it has, and I think that it's a losing strategy to make the investment portfolio that they were making, unless they were willing to spend a lot more money than the adversary was in the offense. This is a key issue to get at in a couple of the new technologies. Quantum computing might advance the offensive capability of cyber warfare. Hypervelocity missiles may make defensive investments utterly worthless. You might have to come up with another way of deterring adversaries rather than buying defensive mechanisms if you want to either defend yourself or deter somebody. So it's an important distinction to get at. And every technology will have a different answer to that conversation. The score sheet for this one, I think we're moving from mass to more distributed and smarter forms of attack. I believe we're moving from heavily manned, but I think we're stopping in the age of augmentation rather than pure autonomy where decision making is going to be made by a machine. We want to be enabled by machines. We want to be able to synthesize a lot of data quickly. I don't think we want to have machines make decisions for us. I do believe that the speed of decision making is going from very slow on the left, what I've given a 3, and we're moving much more into an accelerated degree. I don't think our civilian policymakers have yet embraced that, but I think that's where we're going. And I've tried to give one specific example, I believe, for offense versus defense. And I believe that hypervelocity missile attack is making missile defense, which is currently at a 2, moving into offensive dominance. I think hypervelocity missiles are going to change the game, and we need to rethink about that as an investment portfolio. And I admit this is not an exclusive list, and I'm sure our audience today can add to that. So what I've done now is taken these initial ideas about what can change and try to create a framework to grasp all these. And at the same time, I found out when I did that, I created this model, and then I found that the literature was already covering this model very extensively. So it was interesting. So I've taken the different Likert scores and put them into this 2x2 matrix where I'm trying to deal with on the horizontal, the conventional away and the directness that used to be the past. And I'm positing it against this unconventional, indirect, more homeland-centric scale on the other end. And on the vertical score, states, physicality, competing with indirect methods and cognitive effects and means down at the bottom. And it's just interesting to see the trends and see that there are some overlaps and some directionality. And then when I examined that, it came up with, this is basically 4 areas worthy of study. And I gave each one of them a name that I think actually existed already. So the upper right's obviously conventional war. A more indirect but still conventional and violent way in the lower right would be proxy wars, which is where I thought where we were using hybridity in the past. Proxy is a political relationship between a principal state generally and some other actors, can be states and non-state groups. So proxy to me is a way of describing the political relationship, not the method of warfare. On the left, I have cognitive warfare, again, where the focus of effect is in the mind, and perhaps the mind of the population, not the fielded force. And the upper left, I have societal warfare, which I'll define in some detail in this presentation. What was interesting after coming up with this particular, admittedly linear set of boxes, was then looking in the literature to see who was working in these areas. And there's quite a rich literature of folks who are writing, arguing for the primacy of their particular bloc. So up in the upper right, in the United States, Christian Brose, who used to work for the U.S. Congress, has been a very articulate advocate for thinking entirely conventionally in high-tech warfare against major states. In the lower right, my colleague at the National Defense University, Dr. Sean McFate, has written an articles and books now on what he calls the new rules of war, which I actually think are no rules, no rules. He's talking about a world of proxies, mercenaries, private military groups, that form of security challenge. In fact, he's even arguing that the United States should adopt its own forms of proxy warfare and maximize that over conventional warfare. And of course, the United States has in the past conducted proxy wars and other forms of conflict in the past. So it would be nothing new in that, but he argues this is what it's going to take to be successful in an age of disorder. In the lower left, I have Peter Singer's famous book. Comes in a variety of colors now for folks who want the paperback version, Like War. This is about the weaponization of social media. And then the upper left, Dr. Mike Mazar, I think some other authors in Europe are talking about societal warfare. They may have an expanded definition, more expansive than I am, so I'm going to make an effort to make my own definitions and present each of these in turn. And I'll start with societal warfare. And I put societal warfare in quotation marks. The scare quotes are to raise the issue, is this really a form of warfare? And I believe that many folks in many countries will accept it as both an offensive and a defensive reality they need to prepare for. But I don't think we're giving it enough thought. We certainly didn't up until about 9/11 because we didn't decide to organize ourselves that way. But I do believe that there are states that have doctrines, that have special units and agencies in their government that are in the cyber domain and in other forms are prepared to apply directly and indirectly violent methods and cyber methods against critical infrastructure to either dislocate or paralyze civilian society and our economic activity in order to extract some kind of, by coercing us to get their desired political outcome. And the target set for these, whether it's government services, our economy, our news outlets, food security, energy sources, obviously cyber networks, the healthcare system, and transportation systems. There's a rich target set in free and open societies for folks to get at. And you can, with a few minutes in the open source literature, even as of yesterday, there were attacks on healthcare systems in the United States that had some pretty dire implications. There have been attacks on the British healthcare system that cost $100 million and may have contributed to poor health for some people. This is a rich target set. The North Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese, other states have methods of getting at these, and the history of cyber warfare, or whatever you want to call this kind of warfare, seems to be rising in salience to some folks. Whether it constitutes a form of war, I don't think Hugh Strachan would agree, and most of the Clausewitzians and other cultures get to define what war is, not just us. The other form of warfare, it's very trendy today to discuss. I'll call it cognitive warfare. I should put quotation marks on that. Thomas Rid, now here in the United States, formerly at King's College, didn't believe there was such a thing as cyber war because it didn't meet his Clausewitzian definition of violence and blood. So to him, it might be a shaping activity, it might be an operation, but it's not a form of warfare. Peter Singer, David Patrikakis, others think differently, that you can generate either a security challenge or some desired political output in a conflict via social media or other forms of cyber with the population as the target. We've seen efforts at influencing decision makers. We've seen efforts at influencing electoral activity here in the United States and elsewhere. Whether or not this is a form of warfare, I think is highly debatable. But in the history of political warfare, the use of newspapers or other forms of media access, the age we live in, and the openness and the connectivity of our societies may be creating opportunities and vulnerabilities for other states with different cultures to think differently about this in order to attain their security objectives. The study of proxy wars, very current of late. Dr. McFate, again, I think has been a leading scholar in this. Andrew Mumford in the United Kingdom has been big in this. Vladimir Rauta, now at Reading, has been writing about this in the Rusi Journal and other outputs. Very rich area for debate right now. I believe that it's an artifact of the Cold War, that proxy wars were used. Societies, major states wanted to avoid escalation. They wanted to avoid the attribution. They wanted to avoid the public political debate in their home countries. And so they used proxy forces for major states to contest their influence, particularly, say, Africa, the Middle East, or in Asia. Since we're coming back to an era where major states are contesting their interest, and since those other cultures do have a history of either private military groups, indirect forms of warfare, and the use of surrogates, I think we need to spend more time thinking about this in the future. So I applaud the work of both Dr. Mumford, Sean McFate, and others who are looking at surrogates or proxies in the past. Great power competition may not be about contesting conventional major states with each other, but may be operationalized much more frequently out in the real world via proxy forces, I think, in the future. Something to think about. And then there's the whole issue of conventional warfare, where most modern militaries spend 90% of their time and 90% of their budgets, particularly my country. This is what we think the professional military should do. This is what we focus on. This is what we think is the hardest challenge to deal with. And so we invest the most in it. We invest a lot of money in it. And when I look at what China and Russia are doing, I see them doing much the same thing. Although their cultures are open to more indirect forms, and even though they have structures in United Front organizations or the GRU and political warfare, they are making capability investments and making progress in this conventional bloc. And if you just look at the Chinese doctrine, they talk about systems destruction. They're buying rockets, they're buying unmanned systems, they're buying submarines, they're buying nuclear submarines, they're fielding aircraft carriers, and they're fielding DF-21s and DF-26 that are designed principally as defensive capabilities, but also counter-intervention and regional dominance capabilities that are quite conventional in nature and quite effective. They may not have the numbers that they'd like, they may not have the range that they'd like, but they're making significant progress. The Russians are doing the same thing. Their doctrine, for everybody who reads, Gerasimov and the blending of political and military effects, their strategies are more about destruction of decision-making capabilities and attacking Western cruise missile and missile capabilities as their principal targets. And they're buying capable military capabilities, whether it's the tank, whether it's the next version of their integrated air defense system, or the Caliber missile system that they've demonstrated, or unmanned and remotely operated aerial vehicles. They're making progress. Not as much as they'd like. They don't have as much resources as they'd like. But they are making a significant investment capability. So that's the four blocks. And I gave this presentation once or twice in Europe, and a couple of young people in the audience said, they hated the linearity of the 2x2 box. They encouraged me to create a Venn diagram and to talk about the interfaces, and I ended up finding that very useful. So this is a synthesis that students and participants in conferences have offered me as another way of thinking about the problem set. And what I did like about it, when I did the overlaps, I could find things that I wanted to talk about that had been left out in the conversation. So down there in the interface between cognitive and proxy, this whole notion of catastrophic terrorism or just conventional terrorism is at the interface between non-state actors and getting at psychological effects, which is what terrorism is really all about. At the 9 o'clock there on the overlap between societal warfare and the cognitive warfare, societal warfare was defined in terms of physical effects, the hardware of a society, and the cognitive warfare was defined as the psychological. But in between those two is instruments of hierarchy, such as government, leadership and the credibility of government. There's political organizations, the electoral process, churches. There are things that aren't quite hardware, that aren't quite cognitive, that are actually, some of the software of society that are being attacked by gray zone warfare or political warfare. I prefer the term subversion. So again, that overlap allows that discussion to come into play for all the authors who are studying that particular area. The overlap between society warfare and conventional warfare allows me to get to missile attacks and attacks on the homeland, why we have missile defense in Europe and the United States. That needs to be part of the conversation because there's a big investment in that area too that we might want to discuss. And then between conventional warfare and proxy warfare, I like making a distinction about surrogates as being sort of the PMC or the private military security organization like the Wagner Group or somebody that's created by a state that is not a indirect agent of the state, but a direct but masked source of attack. And there's arguments for why perhaps cyber warfare and drones, belong in that block too, as surrogates that have been brought out in the literature. So beyond just the four and the books and the four blocks, these overlaps offer a little more granularity to think about the future, to bring in more authors and to bring in more debate into the conversation. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. But right now, each of those is presented as if they were all equal or that they were all forms of warfare. And I think the ones on the left, to the traditional military, to those of us who grew up in the Cold War, we didn't think in these terms. We might have thought about the upper half, but we didn't think about the left half of this particular graph very much. This gets to this notion of, again, other cultures see these methods as being legitimate or even necessary or something that they use for either defense or offensive purposes. So there's a couple different ways of thinking about that. But again, we all have different lenses because we come from different societies that have different strategic cultures, that have different histories, different forms of government. In the case of the United States versus Europe, again, different histories of what wars we have conducted and different geographies, where our threats, come from. So American U.S. strategic culture lies largely up into this conventionality block. And we use other agencies of government to worry about the other things. But we invest a significant portion of our treasury into that block. NATO strategic culture or Western Europe or Northern Europe, I think, has a slightly different focus. Again, different history, different understanding of threats, specifically a different understanding of Russia's strategic culture. So they would be less myopic about a purely military, purely Clausewitzian block, the way the American military thinks about it. I think the Chinese have a slightly different culture. I think they understand society because they're more on defense, perhaps. They also have a stability challenge inside, legitimacy challenge inside their culture, but they overlap this way. And if Officer Johnson's in the room, I think there's an understanding that Russian strategic culture is full spectrum. They have organizations, doctrine, and history that cover the gamut from the social side in disorder all the way out to both proxies and conventional capabilities. But again, different societies are going to have different answers to the question, what is war and what is warfare? Some insights in conclusion. I think the risk issue is the most important issue. We need to understand what we should be investing in. We all have marginal investment dollars. Perhaps in the United States, we have more than NATO countries have or other states. But we need to ask some questions, what it is that we need to prepare for. What is the most probable and what is the most dangerous? And coming to grips with how to measure that or how to think about that is very important. We have current priorities today. We need to ask ourselves what those priorities ought to be if we had an expanded conception of what war and warfare is in the 21st century. And then for those of us who are in the national defense business and trying to advise the chairman and the secretary of defense, what should the strategy and the force design focus on, which really gets at the issue of risk. This brings up a conversation. Should we really be spending 90% of $1 trillion, which is what the combination of Europe and the United States is investing in defense every year, on the very marginal occurrence of conventional conflict or not? That's a key question. I've been trying to answer that through a discussion of this using the same matrix and the same framework we established earlier today. what's the most probability? The square area of these graphics, kind of is my crude way of demonstrating the probability, the frequency, and the likelihood of virtual societal warfare or the social cognitive warfare. Far more likely that they're going to go on in terms of the probability of occurrence. Far less likely that we're going to be challenged in the conventional sense, although that possibility ever exists as a probability. And the history graphs that I showed you before would reinforce that. Civil wars, other forms of interference or proxy wars occur much more frequently over time. That's one way of displaying that. These are low cost, but arguably also low likelihood of being decisively or strategically effective too at the same time. In terms of danger or consequences, I would argue that a war, particularly between two major states, is much more violent, much more costly. Consequences of security, stability, casualties, and destruction is far higher in conventional war. Also, the barriers to entry and the cost to create those capabilities are also much higher as well. Again, I do think proxy war has a distinctive probability of occurrence as well. But again, the consequences aren't as contentious until you get to conventionality and fielding rather significant capabilities. Again, that's just two sides of the issue, frequency and consequence. And for me, risk is a function of that combination. And it also involves the context in which each state is making that determination. So for the United States in the past, we just didn't have to think about the homeland, and we focused in this upper right. But now, the last 15 years suggest, and maybe the next 15 years will reinforce, that that's a narrower way of thinking about the problem. And maybe 90% of your defense investment should not be up in the conventional block. Maybe it needs to be redistributed in some way. And that's an issue for each country to make, and each country will have a different answer to that. So let me get to my wrap up, and I hope I'm doing okay on time. You give me a thumbs up, Tim. We're doing okay, good, because I do want to get to the Q&A. Then I have 5 takeaways. Understand your competitors. You also need to understand yourself. Strategic cultures will come up with different perspectives on what is war and warfare. I think in the West, particularly in the U.S. military, this has been a blind spot for the last 20 or 30 years that some have pushed back on, and some of us have not. I do take in this second bullet Sir Lawrence Friedman's warning. There's a lot of ideas out there. Sir Lawrence would push back on, I think, on Franz and I in our opening presentations about this frequency and this complexity and granularity of options. Sir Lawrence's study of the future war is very useful. Highly recommend to everybody. But he's a little bit too much of a skeptic, and I think we need to be a healthy skeptic. We need to be open to these ideas. We need to be open and curious about these alternative arguments that other societies, other authors are bringing about. And we also need to be open and curious about what technologies can and cannot do. So I argue to be curious and skeptical at the same time about these sources of change. You need to be a little bit open, and which I've never been about technology. I'm a low tech guy, but I think we need to be a healthy skeptic, or we will lose the march in defending our societies against change. That said, about technology, there are no silver bullets. Rob Johnson's correct. There's more to warfare than just the technology, the hardware itself. But don't lose fact of the history that the change in the stirrup or the crossbow or the armored knight or the tank or the precision missile or nuclear capabilities did change how war was changed. And it did change who seceded and who didn't secede as well in that race and adaptation. But there's just no silver bullets in that thing. You have to work it hard. Strategic risk needs to be valued by each society. It is a function, a multiplication function, perhaps, of that probability and consequence. Each state, I think, will come up with a different idea of what its risk is. If I lived in Eastern Europe, I'd have a different answer than if I lived in Canada or the United States. I'll admit that. And finally, embrace the chameleon that is war. It takes many forms. People have motivations to adapt and evolve. The history of warfare is not an embrace of continuity from the 13th century to the 17th century to the 19th century to the 21st. It is the study of the change and the adaptation and the success of the competition for innovation and creative thinking across the history of warfare. And we lose that point, I think, too much by embracing the immutable Clausewitz. And with that, I'll leave you with this great comment from Tyrion, which is thinking about war competitively and thinking about your opponent. You will not succeed unless you anticipate them. Thank you very much.
Super, Frank. Thank you very much. And could you keep that slide deck up for a moment?
Okay.
We have about 15 minutes left. We have a number of questions here, and I want to start out with a few questions from the audience. Building on, let me see, Hank Warner. He's asking the questions, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but also synthesizing. What is the use and utility of our current typologies? Are they still valid? If you look at sort of these distinctions, and you showed them in the UCDB or Oslo slide, right? When you spoke, when they speak of internationalized, intrastate, and intrastate, and systemic, what is the use of these categories? If you look at, for instance, Syria, and you see that it's not necessarily an chameleon, but it's rather a Scylla, right? A multi-headed monster. And that fundamental question is also taken up by CJ Moll, and you can see it in the chat, Frank, who raises a minor point, saying that in general in science, the time axis goes from left to right. And then if you could go back to slide 29, Frank, that would place classical warfare in the bottom left, right? If you look at, if you define classical warfare as being conventional and major stage. And his question is, why are you making time running in the opposite direction? But I think it's a really relevant observation, because it touches on something you and I discussed yesterday on what is our notion of traditional war and non-traditional war. So could you please answer to these questions?
Yeah, well, the larger use issue, and thanks for bringing that up, because in my initial outline conversation, I wanted to get at this. This comes up often with the debate on 4GW and hybridity, which was pushed back on quite a bit. So how we think about what war is, particularly in the professional military, how we define our profession, how we define what responsibilities we have and don't have, I think is an important part for the national security community to understand. How we think about war then influences how we structure ourselves and what we don't structure ourselves for, and how we take this risk equation on what things we let society do, what things we let another agency of government to do, whether it's going to be a Homeland Security Department or Interior Ministry, or in the United States, we had nothing. Again, how you structure yourselves, what seems we've created in our minds, in our government, and what people invest in or don't invest in. I think that's an important aspect. And this issue of investment is very important. What, with a marginal amount of investment dollars, and all of our societies after the pandemic are going to have less investment capacity than we have before, where you put the marginal dollar to get the most bang for the buck. So if you're very narrow in the sense of what force is and what it's used for, and you think very conventionally, you get these problems that we had in 2001 in adapting to, misperceiving the problem and only in a conventional sense, fielding and operating and designing a campaign that was not going to be successful, in my view. And I made that argument before 2001 and 2002 and 2003, for those of us who have been arguing for some period of time about the myopia of the American military. Then after you invest it and you structure it, and then it's important on how you teach it. That's why the models, I think, and not trying to push anybody towards my answer, but I think our models and our myopia has been too constrained, and I'm trying to open up the mindset. And I do believe that there are, for different societies, these different arguments, which is where the Pentagon was in 2006. It wanted to get out of the conventional block and wanted to move into the irregular block with permanently structured units and capabilities that we didn't have, that might have been more useful in 2003 to 2007. in terms of advisory capability, in terms of civil affairs capacity, in terms of expeditionary development capabilities, and also information capabilities. I think the adaptation for the Army and the Marine Corps of the United States from 2003 and 2007, always after the fact, always, coming out of the negative consequences we created for ourselves with the mindset and the capabilities we had, looking at it through a conventional lens, again, very narrow, probably created more problems that we then had to adapt. And it took us, more than 2 to 4 years to adapt. And I'm not sure in the next war we're going to get 2 to 4 years, to change. 9/11 in of itself, for those of us, I spent 1999 and 2000 designing a Department of Homeland Security to deal with the catastrophic threat of terrorism in the United States. So the things that Mike Mazar and others are arguing now there in the upper left-hand block, was something we anticipated in 1999 in the American intelligence community. And there was a lack of imagination in perceiving the threat and reading what people could be both wanting to do and capable of doing. We just didn't create the urgency in the change. Although in the United States Congress, to its credit, there were bills in the United States Congress in 2000 and 2001 to create a Department of Homeland Security and ensure a better defense in the United States that existed before 9/11. That's the large answer to why we think about this. To break out of mindsets, to stay up with what is changing, to prepare our institutions. It might not be the military solution. And again, I got more abuse from the Pentagon about the Department of Homeland Security, not because they disagreed with the threat to the homeland. What they disagreed with was the creation of an agency that might take more dollars away from a Pentagon that wanted to invest in its upper right-hand block. And that issue. I don't understand the time question, but I have written it down to deal with it. But one of the aspects in this framework, the time dimension in this framework was not employed. I didn't get time. I didn't get the temporal decision-making speed in this. But I would also think that I should, and I think there's both in the conventional war, homeland, and the social media war, time is a big dimension. And so I do need to rethink that. And I thank the questioner for challenging me on that.
Great. And additional remark on that. The observation was also classical warfare. And for CJ Mol, I just wanted to sort of problematize the notion of classical warfare, right? Classical warfare, is that our Western post-Westphalian concept of state-on-state warfare? In that case, it is. But war is, of course, much older than that. I wanted to, in that light, I wanted to ask you, Frank, we've been talking about, and at the beginning, you were talking about war's enduring nature versus its changing character, right?
Right.
And Thucydides really was, I think, or at least also the way he is cited on those who think it's enduring. And one of his famous sayings is, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, right? But arguably over the past few years, we've really seen we've been seeing a leveling of the playing field and a democratization of the means of violence, essentially meaning that the Davids in this world stand a better chance fighting against the Goliaths. And I think already this year, you see the bellwethers of that development. Over the past few weeks, we've seen Azerbaijan fighting against Armenia. We've seen Azerbaijan deploying long-range fires, ballistic missiles, UAVs, loitering munitions. And that is emblematic of a more general trend, right? In which more than 30 states have ballistic missiles, over 100 states have drones, 36 states have already armed their drones, and so on and so forth. So the key question here is, in DC, there is this great emphasis on great power competition now, right? And preparing to fight China and Russia. What do you think? In preparing for great power competition, will the US and NATO be able to also stand a chance and navigate conflict environments in which they will face also different actors?
Well, there is a perception in America that overlaps into the European conversation a little bit, that if you focus only on a great power, then you're only interested in conventional war and high intensity warfare. And when I hear some officers in America, and to include up to Secretary Esper, whose last speech I heard had the word, I think, high end in it 2 or 3 times. So there is a rationale in the Pentagon for 15 years of distraction to do other things, that they want to invest in the far right-hand side of the spectrum for their investments. The readiness bins, the lethality that Mr. Mattis, stressed, takes the mind to there, as does the range, radar, cannon, the Chinese and the Russian military modernization, create a dynamic that get the building excited about that. But in the strategy itself, the notion of competition short of armed conflict is there. Colin Gray's quote about not being, myopically focused on a preclusive form of warfare is a quote in the classified strategy. It's an unclassified paragraph. Again, it's a verbatim quote of the late Colin Gray's, thought process. So this notion of having to deal with, at least, again, when General Dunford talked about competition short of armed conflict, I don't think he was thinking about this far left. I think he was thinking about more proxies and surrogates and more indirect forms and terrorism. He was, I think, thinking about the right-hand still side of this thing. This concept is trying to expose the entire investment portfolio. And I think the pandemic does that as well. Social resilience, supply chain and economic security resilience, healthcare infrastructure and other forms of critical infrastructure are widening and at risk in our societies. And so a broader sense of understanding of what entails national security, and that it might not just be myopically about major states, was actually in the strategy itself, but it's not getting the emphasis, and it's not where the money went. It's not necessarily where the money was intended when it was crafted, because there was some decade to overcome in terms of new capabilities, and not legacy capabilities, new capabilities over time. And that strategy is going to take, several years to move the Pentagon towards something. And this argument, kind of balances out that bureaucratic inclination to think only in terms of conventional war, which, again, one thing I left out of the conversation, when you discuss this conversation, we think about military, we're thinking only about compellence, when we go to war. This investment also deals with deterrence and the coercion about whose interests are being covered and protected. So for the United States, we're not just investing in ourselves, we're investing in our alliance architecture, we're reassuring our friends, and we're, coercing's a harsh word, but we're enforcing a rule set and an international order with that investment. And our opponents are making similar investments. They're competitors and not rivals, enemies, or adversaries yet, and hopefully won't be if you make the right investments. But again, that balance is the strategic issue about going on. And I do take your point. In the United States, great power competition is assumed to be great power war. And I believe that's an erroneous reading of the document, but it's an accurate reading of the psychology in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And Christian Bartolome, thank you for your question about whether the low frequency of conventional war may be the result of the large investment in conventional forces. And I think what Frank just sort of explained is that this broader investment in a portfolio of alliances and robust military capabilities may have contributed to that significantly. Frank, I wanted to sort of go on and ask you another question, because we're almost nearing the end of this session, which concerns technology and the ways in which technology is used, right? And you, rightfully so, I think, cautioned for focusing too much on technology per se. And I wanted to bring up Martin van Kreeveld, a fellow countryman, really, who later on went to Israel. And he says that military revolutions essentially require two things, right? An objective development, meaning a technology, and then a man or an organization who will seize that objective development, ride it, and steer it in the right direction. It is my feeling that in our defense discussions, we talk a lot about the platforms, right? But not so much about the ways in which we can put these platforms to use. And I know I'm overly simplifying, but if I think about how other strategic actors have been very successfully experimenting really over the past decade, both in sort of in their modus operandi, but also with systems, operational systems in the battlefield. I'm thinking ISIS, I'm thinking Russia here. I think we're facing a daunting challenge. So in that context, how do you sort of see that we could shift that focus from platforms and from technology to how we're actually going to use those technologies, and what can we do to sort of facilitate and support that?
Yeah, well, this gets to another line that Mr. Mattis frequently uses. That's in the front couple pages of the National Defense Strategy. The importance of framing the problem and defining the key operational challenge. If you're just looking at toys and technology for the sake of looking for the breakthrough, there's some value in understanding what that can do for you, because you also learn what it might do for an opponent. So you need to understand hypervelocity. You might need to understand artificial intelligence. But the perspective that Mr. Mattis had that's reflected in the American defense strategy is you need to define those key operational challenges and solve those conceptually, doctrinally in your mind, and look at the integrated conceptualization, the organizational change, and the technology all simultaneously in an integrated way. So technology is not even in the lead. It's the conceptual identification of the problem or the operational challenge you're trying to solve. And Mr. Mattis had a pretty articulate way of defining this, and I'm not saying very well, but he draws upon Wick Murray's book, not Martin's work, which has some very good parts about the overemphasis on control and certitude in technology, which is also very good. But Wick Murray said, the militaries that innovated the best focused first on the problem. It was always a real operational problem, a two-front problem or a hider-finder problem or an offense-defense problem. You focus first on framing the problem. Mr. Mattis always used to spend an inordinate amount of time making sure that the problem definition, and there's a list in the American defense strategy of the operational challenges that are prioritized and described. I can't get into that level of detail, but we defined operational challenges very specifically that we thought needed to be solved. And the Joint Staff and the services are supposed to get on those with the level of experimentation, concept development, further R&D investment, and the integrated application of the problem set, the technology, and the organizational change. Many of these might either create a new unit or create a new capability that'll have an organizational change. I see that kind of ongoing effort, particularly inside the Marine Corps that I've been monitoring and writing about lately. That the hardest part, it's easy to add things to an organization. It's very hard to reshape an institution and its mindset and its culture and its organization. But I see at least that in the case of the United States Marine Corps. And I think the joint world writ large is moving towards that more integrated change. But again, hard.
Good. Hey, we're final question, and then we'll move to a wrap up. Frank, maybe you can stop sharing your screen, and so we can see your full screen. I'm going to pose a final question and then move to Frans and give you the floor for a final wrap up. But we wanted to ask you, Frank, and it's bringing different questions from our audience together, that in light of the heating strategic competition, right, and the focus on great power competition, what do you see as the division of labor, the strategic division of labor between the US and Europe? Is this the US doing the cooking and the Europeans doing the dishes, right? Is this specializations in different warfighting roles? Or will we see geographic specialization with the US focusing on the Pacific and the Europeans starting to focus more and more on Europe? What are your thoughts on that?
I've been giving that a little bit of thought lately, so I do appreciate that as a good question. In terms of prioritization, I think you need to go back to a strategic balance of power question. I see the strategic balance of power in Asia closer to parity in the aggregate sense of China with a limited number of friends and allies, and then the United States with a distributed constellation, but not a NATO-like entity. So you have the Australians, you have the Japanese in the United States, and you have the perhaps some other help from other countries that might be partners but not yet formal allies. But I look at the balance of power there. I see more question marks and an eroding balance of power marked by Chinese assertiveness lately. They're obviously not deterred, and they're getting nasty with a lot of people in a lot of different dimensions against the Vietnamese, the Philippines, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, everybody in either political, informational, particularly economic, power. So I see the division of prioritization is having to resolve that against a power that's more than 1 billion people, that's spending somewhere between 160 to 250 billion dollars a year in purchasing parity equivalent, doesn't have to spend $50 billion a year for its health system, isn't paying lieutenants, $80,000 a year, isn't paying privates first class, $50,000 and $60,000 a year the way we do. I see Asia having more instability, greater challenges, and also greater importance to the region given its economic importance to the world. The economic shift, is into Asia and away from the West, and we need to understand our opportunities, our prosperity, and our friends are more at risk there than I argue than in Europe, where I believe that NATO from a structural perspective, Europe from a demographic and economic potential is just a very strong. It might not be as united, and obviously the northern states and the southern states have different threat perceptions, but I think that our reassurance initiatives and the investments, particularly the last 5 years, have been very useful in balancing that out. So the strategic balance is more at risk in Asia and Europe, and we have made some significant advances in that. I think that there isn't a operational division of labor that should be advanced. I do believe that we're helping in space. We're going to provide in missile defense. There's some division of labor in that area. We'll have to make more investments in strategic mobility because we have to get to Europe, and we need to improve that. The recreation of the Second Fleet and some of the activities in the North Atlantic are, getting at that. So that's part of our contribution, as is the space, the ISR, and the missile defense. But we're still going to have to contribute to the fighting aspect of that community as well. I don't know what's going to go on in the next administration with respect to defense investments. I expect some less, but I expect to see a reinforcement of multilateralism. I expect to see a show of respect towards NATO. Under the table, there'll still be some pressures for meeting the Wales pledge, but I think there's also going to be a recognition that because of the pandemic, we're going to have to think about that in a different way. So there'll be a slowing of the NATO enhancement capabilities, perhaps over some period of time. But I think there'll be a greater appreciation for Europe, a greater appreciation for both the EU and NATO, and a greater transatlantic community starting next Tuesday.
Well, Frank, thank you. With these hopeful words, I think we can conclude your presentation. Thank you very much. It was again a pleasure to listen to your insights. And I'll give the floor to Frans to formally wrap up and say goodbye to our participants. Frans, could you unmute yourself and take the floor?
Excellent, Frank. Thanks indeed. I'm not popping up, apparently. Well, I can still see myself. All right. Frank, thanks indeed. I'm not going to wrap this up. I'm going to put it in perspective. What you've done for us is peel off that question what the future of war might look like, and peel off the question what those futures, plural, might actually mean for defense planning for the United States, but implicitly also of course, for European nations. Now, you've provided a very coherent synthesis of the various strands of thought that are out there what the future might look like. And I recall an article that you wrote not so long ago, where you stated the future is plural, and instead of the future of war, we should be talking about the futures, plural, of war and warfare. I think this has been a very timely discussion, because in the Netherlands we just have been seeing the new defense vision. And the challenge now is to translate that vision into answers in terms of what sort of capabilities are needed to actually fill in the ambitions of that vision. And I think your coherent structure, your coherent synthesis, and the questions that you put out there are the sorts of questions and the frameworks that we need to come to answers about the sort of capabilities that in the Netherlands and in NATO we need looking into the future. So thanks for that indeed. It's been wonderful. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. And I think looking at the audience, which has constantly been about 200 and only slightly died down to about 130 right now, I think that is just testament about the value and the quality of your presentation. So Frank, on behalf of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies and the Royal Society for Health Studies, thank you very much, and we hope to keep in touch.